Born to working class parents, Jim was the third child of 12 in the family. He was educated at the local GBS, was a good scholar. He was a good athlete and played with the local GAA team, Monaghan Hearts. Jim's easy disposition and big heart won him many friends among his contemporaries, growing up and later among his comrades in arms. Jim Lynagh approached manhood as the occupation was opening a new page in the history of reaction. He witnessed the civil rights campaign being met with deadly violence and quickly understood that only through armed struggle and resistance could democracy be achieved in Ireland. He joined the Republican Army aged 16 and dedicated his life to the cause of national liberation and the establishment of a socialist republic. Jim endured many hardships through the struggle. In 1973, he was badly injured in a premature explosion, arrested, and spent 5 years in Longkesh. While in prison, he read widely and honed his understanding of the nature of oppression, both locally and internationally. He became a convinced Marxist and believed that national liberation could not be achieved without economic liberation for the working class. Jim Lynagh knew the importance of political organisation and struggle and the need for popular support. On his release from prison in 1979, Jim was elected as a Sinn Féin councillor, combining a guerrilla life with the political struggle. Jim was arrested many times, brutalised and beaten. He was further charged and imprisoned many times. Jim took part in many battles and was as feared by the occupation forces as he was loved by the risen people. Sadly, at Loughgall in 1987, Jim made the ultimate sacrifice in the sure belief that the struggle to end imperialism in Ireland was the only path to ensure peace, democracy and the socialist republic he had lived for. Jim Lynagh was a humble volunteer, and having known him personally, I can say he would be heartened that comrades are continuing in the pursuit of freedom through these discussions today. So now I'll hand over to Tommy McKearney, a former hunger striker, prisoner, activist, and Dr. Fearghal to have a conversation about Republicanism in Fermanagh and Tyrone and the border areas.
Margaret Barry, agus tá fáilte raibh ach an duine tá anseo, agus nár fáilte raibh Fearghal Bhloscaidh as den Ganam. We're talking here today about republicanism in Tyrone and Fermanagh. Now, what we're not going to do is deliver a detailed year-by-year account of republicanism in the two areas. But suffice to say that there has been a long history of republicanism in these areas. Michael Barrett, a name possibly not so well known, Michael Barrett was hanged in 1867 as a Fenian from McKearney in County Fermanagh for his activities in London. Through the middle of the 19th century, Tom Clark and the Kellys in Dungannon were Fenians who engaged with the Royal Irish Constabulary. So, militant Irish republicanism is not something that has recently arrived in these counties of Fermanagh and Tyrone. A long history of resistance to occupation, British rule and colonialism. Now, for the most part, we're going to look today at these two areas, how they have participated in the Republican struggle from the 1950s until the present day. So, what, for example, Irish republicanism achieved almost global recognition in these counties, for these counties, in 1981 with the election of Bobby Sands as an MP for Fermanagh and South Tyrone. thing about it is that Bobby Sands' name has acquired legend for right all, and justifiably so. But in spite of the tremendous impact of Bobby's election, he wasn't the first Irish Republican prisoner to be elected from this constituency, from these areas. So I'm going to ask Fearghal, Bhloscaidh, to maybe comment or elaborate.
Yeah, do I need this? Am I okay? No, I'm okay. So, well, today we're talking about like resistance to colonialism in Tyrone and Fermanagh, and I'm actually going to read it. I'll not mention his name. The local unionist councillor talking about the campaign of Jim Lynagh and his comrades, and he said their campaign was one of pure sectarian hatred, a calculated attempt at genocide against anyone who didn't bow to their warped ideology. Well, we're here to counter that, and that's basically a label, right? The resistance to colonialism in Tyrone and Fermanagh. We're in Maguire country now. We're from O'Neill country, right? That colonialism is not an event. Colonialism is a process, right? So for the people, the only anti-sectarian constituency or tendency in Irish history, which is Irish Republicanism, to be accused of sectarianism is ridiculous. Sectarianism is an Irish manifestation of the same thing that racism does in the southern states of the United States of America. Sectarianism is an instrument of social control under a system of colonialism, and sectarianism was imposed on the people here. Right? The way that colonialism was managed here manifests itself across Irish history. The people who wanted to break sectarianism in Ireland, the people who wanted to overturn colonialism in Ireland, were Republicans. And it was founded by Irish Protestants. It was founded by radical Irish Protestants during the Enlightenment under the influence of the French Revolution. And those are the political progenitors or beginnings of the struggle of Jim Lynagh and his comrades, and of the struggle of every single Irish Republican in Tyrone and Fermanagh since. Right? It's not... Irish Republicanism acknowledges the conquest, acknowledges sectarianism, right? And wants to overturn it through the creation of a new civic nation based on universal rights. So Republicans are the most anti-sectarian people in Ireland. The people who engage in sectarianism and genocide in Ireland, they're the colonial and imperial powers. If you want to be, don't throw words like genocide and ethnic cleansing out, right, unless you understand what they mean. Britain has carried out 3 genocides in this area. The first genocide was when they drove O'Neill and Maguire out, and they used the word, it's in the Cecil State Papers of Ireland, extirpation, extermination of the Irish population. And they bleached the whole of East Ulster, right? And they carried out scorched earth and famine here. The second one was Cromwell. And he comes over a half century later, he does exactly the same thing. And we were still fighting here. The Maguires, and Owen Roe O'Neill comes back from the continent, and we still struggled against British imperialism. And their third genocide, and I talked about this in Al Jazeera recently, was the deliberate attempt to destroy and hold or impart a people, and that was carried out in 1848 by Charles Trevelyan in the Treasury in London, when they deliberately instituted a policy to drive Irish cottagers off the land. So the imperial power is genocidal. The imperial power is sectarian. Irish Republicans have stood against sectarianism and genocide throughout, and the working class and lower class people of Fermanagh and Tyrone have been the backbone of Irish Republicanism here, and we have a long tradition of Irish Republicanism in this area. In fact, the first Republican that I came across who was elected anywhere was John McElvogue in Dungannon in 1888, was elected as a local councillor, and he was elected in opposition to constitutional nationalists. So that's the other thing, or the other tendency in Irish history that Republicans have always stood against. It's the people who accept sectarianism, accept the way that the world is, and try and carve a niche out for their class within it. And that's the pubocracy, the priest, and the local Shawneen or Bigwit or Gumby. So that tendency's always run through this area. So in the 1950s, it was ordinary working class Fenians in this area, because these people were the grandchildren of the Fenians in this area, who backed Liam Kelly and Sir Ulu, and elected him to Stormont in Mid-Ulster, and then elected the 2 prisoners from the Omagh raid, okay, Clark and Mitchell, Tom Mitchell in Mid-Ulster as well. So there was a consolidated groundswell of working class Republican support in this area, and it's always been in this area, and it stood in opposition to colonialism and imperialism and sectarianism, and it stood in opposition to the clergyman and the publican and the local doctor, solicitor and teacher, unfortunately, who wanted to cut their cloth to suit and maybe talked about it in meetings the nights of Columbanus the odd time.
Exactly.
He was an independent Labour Republican. And the Irish National Fosters and Williams Day.
Yes. So thanks. Hello. So okay. So okay, fair enough. If you can't hear me, just let me know. Okay. So Phil Clark and Tom Mitchell were elected in 1955. The Operation Harvest, which maybe better known as the 56 campaign of the IRA, started a year later. So Clark and Mitchell were elected. Both of them actually excluded. The British used their legislation to deny democracy to the area, as they have often done, as a constant feature of British policy. They did the same when Bobby Sands was elected. But oddly enough, the two men were elected with overwhelming support, obviously from the ground, from electoral support. But the 56 campaign began then. 56, very close to here, with a legendary operation in Broogborough, 4 to 5 miles from where we're sitting. Sean South and Fearghal Hannon from County Monaghan were killed in the operation. And I mean, to this very day, we're familiar with the song Sean South and the Patriot Game, but for some reason or other, in spite of the fact that there was a large, overwhelming electoral support for the campaign, the IRA campaign of the Operation Harvest, as it was known to the IRA command, fizzled out. It wasn't really the same purchase on the people as you would imagine, maybe from the electoral support that had enjoyed. Could you maybe comment on that further?
I think the constituent elements, so the first of all, there was no nationalist candidate standing against them in these two constituencies, so they may have received, mightn't have been a full indication of the level of support for republicanism, and it might have also been support for prisoners as opposed to support for an armed campaign. There was a groundswell of belief within the IRA in that period, and because of agitation in this area by people like Ciarollo and their raid on Bhloscaidh, they thought they had to act. And initially it gained widespread support in the south, but what both the southern and the northern establishments do is, because remember that the campaign begins under Clan the Public, they're reasonably sympathetic, and then when Fianna Fáil comes in and Charlie Haughey comes in, he introduces internment. And it's under the conditions of internment, north and south. Brian Faulkner, the hammer of the IRA in the north is his nickname. They introduce internment, and they lay down their weapons. They don't decommission or surrender or anything like that. They lay down their weapons, and they say it's because of a lack of popular support. So while they felt that the conditions were ripe for a military campaign based on raids across the border because of this electoral support, actually the conditions for the generation of a working class insurrection, which will happen later on, weren't there to the same extent. And if you look, a lot of the same building blocks are there in 1969 as had been there in the 50s, but what is there before 1969 is a mass working class movement, which is beaten off the streets, right, and faces the same state repression. But it's the continual revolving and pummeling of that state suppression that harnesses this mass movement for civil rights and a peaceful civil rights movement into a decision by large sections of the working class that the only legitimate response to this level of state imperialist oppression is to fight back. So there's a famous saying that the oppressed never choose their tactics, they always have their tactics imposed on them. And the conditions for a militant Republican campaign, while there were good indications that it might have been successful or it might have gained widespread support, and it does initially, it peters out. It peters out because it doesn't have that cohesive momentum that the later campaign has. And I think one of the key things here is that before the campaign begins in 1969 or in 1970, there is a groundswell, there is a mass mobilisation on the streets of ordinary working class people in these areas. There's tens of thousands of people out on the streets demanding basic democracy and justice. And when then that's met by the heavy hand of the state and imperialism in successive blows from 1969, 70, 71, 72, that's the furnace, that's the crucible in which then a working class insurrection takes place, and that's the environment and where ordinary people say, I have no other choice. I'm not going to back down in a corner for another 50 years. I'm going to have to stand up. And I think that's the key difference between those two campaigns. I think the historical, it's not that the ideology of Irish republicanism hadn't any credence. Their objective analysis of the imperial structures has always been legitimate. Britain is an empire, Ireland is a colony, and the Irish people have a right to freedom. But it's only at certain conjunctures and under certain historical circumstances and conditions then that you get that recipe of mass mobilisation to that end. And sometimes it comes with, what did Lenin say? Sometimes nothing happens for decades, and then decades happen within a week.
Within a week, of course. And at the same time too, I suspect that maybe the fact that conditions on the ground were identified one after the other in 68 and 69, identified housing, employment, even cultural rights. I remember watching in 1960 Danny Blanchflower scoring for Tottenham Hotspur. As a child watching Tottenham Hotspur win the FA Cup. County Down won the Sam Maguire the same year, first time it was taken over the border, but there was no mention of it in the BBC.
No.
So even not only were we denied economic rights, but were also cultural rights. But these were all identified in 69 in a way perhaps they weren't identified in the 50s, although undoubtedly through the 50s, 40s and 50s, treatment here in Fermanagh and Tyrone across the 6 counties was every bit as bad, maybe worse. We're sitting here in Brookborough country, which, if you'll forgive me for using the expression. But, are you sure you never heard tell of him?
No.
But Basil Brook was just every bit as nasty as anything else in the 50s and 40s, and his henchmen. In fact, there was clearances almost again here, as far as I know, there's parts of the country here, forests cleared out and planted with forests to clear the people from the land to force them into emigration.
The objective structural conditions were the same. What was partition? Look back there, our unionist councillor friend will not mention, like give him the benefit of mentioning his name. What was partition? Partition was a manner in which big house unionism and Orange Capital used working class loyalism, right, and sectarianism as a proxy to keep its control. So there's massive expulsions in Belfast in 1920. The Orange State was built on an orange moral economy, right? Working class Protestants didn't have much but more than Catholics. We'll guarantee you a job. We'll gerrymander electoral divisions, and we'll militarise the area, right? So the James Craig, Brooke's predecessor, had more armed men under his control than the government of Austria in 1921. Right? There was a policeman for every 650 people in England and Wales, every 700 people in Scotland. There was a policeman for every 140 people in the north, and they were directed against a third of the population. And that third of the population was under the Special Powers Act. And John Balthazar Vorster, the father of apartheid South Africa, said he'd give up every single piece of coercive legislation he had for one clause of the Northern Ireland Special Powers Act. That's what he said. So those conditions were the same. And Brookborough gets up and he says, don't have a Catholic about your place. During the Great Depression, when that orange monolith's about to break. But what Brookborough does is he does working class nationalists around here a great favour, believe it or not. Under pressure from his own working class to accept the British Labour government's welfare state, and the conditions for Clement Attlee's welfare state to operate in the north is that everybody has to get it. Mm-hmm. Catholics don't have to go on to the same extent on that conveyor belt of immigration. And they can stay at home on the dole, and they can get free education. And the outworkings of that is change social conditions. And it's the generation that emerges from the 1947 Education Act who educate themselves, who hit the glass ceiling of discrimination, who live in a period in the 60s when there's a general tendency towards greater freedom. It's when that generation comes to fruition, and again I tell my students in St Mary's that like, all serious and significant events in Irish history started in Kennan. Right? So it was the campaign for social justice. And the Bhloscaids, they're no relative. My granny used to clean their house, but they're no relative. It's a campaign for social justice that provides the statistics for this, gains global attention for it, and this is the 1960s then, when there is the development of what's called mass media. So the same structural discrimination and orange bigotry is there the whole time. The same sectarianism is wired into this place the whole time. And the nationalist population are suffering doubly under, and working class Protestants are suffering under too. But it's the confluence and coming together of these different historical trends and conditions that leads to change in the 1960s. And part of that is that you have a generation of educated working class people who aren't locked into those structures created in 1921, aren't in a pubocracy, right? They're not, they're in the white mice or anything like that there, right? And are prepared to challenge it. And I think that's where them in that phase of struggle comes from. So it's always a collision between the objective reality and the objective understanding of what your historical conditions are, and we have a class-based understanding of that, and historical conditions. When those two things come together, then you can have positive change, and then you can have struggle, mass struggle.
Yes. And I think it's interesting the point you're making about an educated working class that emerged as a result of the free education.
Mm-hmm.
And they were able to highlight in detail the injustices, notably our neighbour Bernadette McKearney.
We'll give Cooks down our bowl, something like,
Just for the record, there is no such place as Brookborough. The Irish name for Brookborough is Ahalun. Ahalun.
Right.
A-G-H-A-L-U-N.
This for the record, a heckler from the gallery has intervened with a good point.
He's trying to decolonise Brookborough, that's what it is.
So, then, with 69 and qualitative difference between then and the 50s campaign, resistance then develops.
Yeah, the question is, political violence and war is the nadir of human experience. It's the worst thing that human beings can do. War, right? Tom Barry says all war is terrible. He fought in the First World War and he fought in the War of Independence. It's the only war that I can justify myself as a war for national liberation, right?
Yes.
So people have to. It takes an awful lot for human beings to engage in political violence and take the life of human beings. And the degree to which a war, and it was a insurrection in the North, I think, consequence of the response of the state to the civil rights campaign, right? So in 1969, you have the police and loyalist mobs and the Shankill Defence Association basically mass. That is ethnic cleansing, by the way. See, when you burn entire streets out with the forces of the state, it happens the 14th and 15th of August 1969. That leads to a split in the Republican movement. But the provisional movement that emerges out of that is a small movement within a small movement. Right? Where does it gain its traction? Well, it gains its traction from the fact that Ted Heath and Reginald Maudling come in and they give Chichester Clark the British Army and they say, put a lid on that. We don't want to hear anything about Ireland. We have the miners to deal with. We have winters of discontent. Knock them boys on the head the way I used to knock them on the head. But the problem is, they're an educated mass movement. They've spent 2 years in the civil rights movement. And what's the response? The response is when they defend themselves in St Matthews, it's a false curfew. And they alienate the whole working class of the lower falls. What's their next response to that? Albert Einstein, if insanity is doing the same thing again and expecting a different result. The next year, Brian Faulkner takes his place and he introduces internment. And he interns over 450 nationalists alone. There's nearly 2,000 nationalists by Christmas. They're they're condemned as torturers by the European Court of Human Rights. They kill the Paratroop Regiment murder 11 unarmed civilians in Ballymurphy. What does that do to that scope within the nationalist working class who are prepared to say we can't go on with this anymore and we have no other alternative but to fight fire with fire? Well, that expands. And then what was your other alternative? Your other alternative was to continue mass mobilisation, and people did. People went out in the NICRA went out and organised anti-internment rallies. How did that end up? With an anti-internment rally in Derry in January 1972, the Paratroop Regiment murdered 14 people. So under those circumstances, this is the way that it's always presented. So the coloniser and the imperialist always calls the freedom fighter a terrorist. Right? Hamas are terrorists, okay? The IRA are terrorists, right? The reason why they're terrorists is because there's no introspection and self-examination of their own agency and their own oppression, and they can't understand why these people are fighting, why ordinary people are prepared to risk their lives and to risk their children's lives and to engage in violence. Because for them, it's an abstract form of irrational terror. For the people who are oppressed, it's the only avenue they have open to try and fight back. So if you want to understand where the provisional IRA came from, yes, it comes from internal splits within the Republican movement, but I think it's also a symptom of the manner in which British imperialism operated in that period, and it operated as it's always done. It armed the colonial settler element, it armed the reactionary element, and it says, sort them people out. But what you were dealing with a different type of, if you want to use a pejorative, uppity Fenian.
Yes.
Educated, politicised, and knew their rights and were prepared to fight for them, and weren't prepared to go and suffer another 50 years of structural discrimination and orange rule. And I think that's probably I think that's the primary reason for converting the provisional movement into what was a small movement within the Republican movement into a mass movement and a mass insurrection.
Just a point strikes me too when you're talking about anti-colonialism or colonialism, that the British at the very beginning made, I think, possibly from their point of view, a mistake in identifying what was happening here was a colonial uprising rather than possibly a lack of democracy. Mm-hmm. Because technically, although we don't like to have to talk about the fact, but Northern Ireland is constitutionally an integral part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Yeah. But at the same time, effectively, the deep state in London does not see us as integral. No,
that's the contradiction. Contradiction between the way they portray this place. We're a neutral arbiter between these warring tribes, and we are a functioning liberal democracy. But by the way, we're going to get Frank Kitson to apply counterinsurgency against these working class Fenians. So that's the contradiction. The myth that they've created for themselves in this place does not conform to historical reality. And the great tragedy of that for British people is that Ames Césaire called it a colonial boomerang. What you do in your colonies, the rights, the freedoms, the democracy that you destroy in your colonies, always comes home.
Yes.
Tony Blair did it. He just transferred the Special Powers Act and he called it the Terror Act, right? And you'll see the centralisation of power and authoritarianism and this colonial practice across Britain, the United States of America today, and the great liberal freedoms of merry old England are no longer there. So what you practice in your colonies will always come home to roost.
Yeah, I heard the same said about colonial British practices in their empire were actually practiced by the Nazis in Europe. Thing then, just let's go back for a second or two to the working class. It strikes me, or I think that when looking back, that it was a working class uprising, essentially. The working class supported the armed campaign, the middle class supported the SDLP, effectively, breakdown. But support in the working class was practically universal, and possibly maybe a mistake, tactical mistake that the Unionists made was to isolate working class areas. You go to the Ballygully Road housing estate where we could walk through it freely because they had decided that they'd just push all the Catholics into one area. Same with rural parts where were isolated and pushed into rural parts. Now, of course, the Loch Shore, notoriously, colonialism had excluded the Gael into the Badlands. So, would you think then that there was that element of possibly a mistake? Because there was, and I remember very clearly, like we had almost universal support. Certainly, nobody ever turned us away.
No, I think there's a convergence of historical conditions. There's the plantation, the famous saying was the Protestants got the land, the Catholics got the view, which is when I was driving down the Clogher. It shouldn't be called the Clogher Valley, it should be called Tyrone, because that's the bit where all used to rear all the cattle. But so there's a convergence there between the historic, and that's what I said. Colonisation is not an event; it's a process, and it's the same thing about the ghettoisation of working class people in certain areas. The thing about republicanism is, Wolfe Tone says, if the men of property will not support us, we'll have to turn to that great respectable class, the men of no property. Should be women of no property as well, obviously, right? So the thing about republicanism, republicanism is the voice of the Irish working class and rural poor. It's the idiom of the oppressed in Ireland. It's our Spanish anarchism. It's our Russian Narodniks. It's our, and it manifests itself across history. Yes. And it's always been there. And it's based on working class people's natural response to their oppression, which is baseline communism.
Yes.
Capitalism wouldn't survive if ordinary people weren't decent, because capitalism is based on a type of psychopathy where everybody's out to destroy everybody else and get the upper hand on them and accumulate as much wealth as possible. If ordinary people adopted that philosophy, the world would be incinerated in a week. It might be incinerated yet, but that's a different story. So, but what that baseline communism or anarchism or solidarity is, it's the natural response of the oppressed to their alienation under the system or the structure that they live in. And that's the wellsprings of popular republicanism.
Just then, we are coming to an end here, but just a reference particularly to the man we're commemorating here with this school. Talk about County Monaghan. Now, I think the same applies to County Monaghan. You're talking about the working class. I remember areas in rural areas, legendary areas such as Knockatallon, and then of course you go into South Monaghan and Enniskeane, where there was the same level of practically of support for the movement that you would have had in working class areas in Tyrone or Fermanagh.
Yeah. No, I think it's the national popular will. I keep dropping names here, but that's Gramsci's idea of it, is that you look at the opinion poll in the presidential election. I'm not going to publicly equate Catherine Connolly with support for the armed struggle. The armed struggle was a means of achieving the objectives of a free Ireland, a free, independent, sovereign Ireland controlled by the people of Ireland, the ownership of Ireland for the people of Ireland. That's 1960. That's what popular republicanism is. There is a groundswell of support within the general Irish psyche of ordinary Irish people, working Irish people, for that type of politics. And at different junctures in our history, it has been mobilised into mass movements. Right? We talked about Einstein in terms of the British, the doing the same thing and perhaps failing might be a symptom of the way that we were organising our republicanism. I would argue against vanguards and substitutism, and I would argue for broad mass movements. The problem with vanguards is that they can be started by sound lads like Lenin, but they can be taken over by less sound lads like Joseph Yushasvili, Stalin, yeah. Okay. Now, some of you might have a better opinion of Stalin than me, but the problem with vanguards is that they can be co-opted. And the history of Irish republicanism is about it's like a cycle of mass movements and then their leadership being co-opted or transformed into the Shawning class. I mean, not say who's in the Shawning class at the minute, but what you have to do then is to do what Connolly would have proposed, is to create a mass movement based on democracy. And it doesn't matter, you can't decapitate a democratic movement. And in a world which is increasingly controlled by a tiny percentage of the population who are accumulating massive wealth and prepared to use massive violence in order to maintain their position, it's only through mass democratic struggle that you can achieve the strength to challenge them. Because if you go back down that road again of here's the select few are going to achieve it for us, they'll either be bought or destroyed. And that's the history. So we maybe go back to second international Marxism and try as far as we can to build a mass democratic movement. And that's the movement, I think, that will best respond to that intrinsic, that inherent type of popular republicanism that resides in the hearts of most Irish people. With Irish people who have hearts, anyway. Right. There's plenty of Irish people have plenty of money, but very little heart.
Well, can I just then maybe bring this to an end by quoting from another County Monaghan man, James Connolly. Only the Irish working class remain as the incorruptible inheritors of the fight for freedom in Ireland. So I think that's
a great way to finish, yeah.
Right. So Sin Will or Fearghal. Did you want to?
I meant a bit of a hint. It can take any sort of. So it can be a federation of community groups, charity organisation, cooperatives. It can go through the traditional trade union movement. It doesn't have to conform to the conditions of the 19th century, where the idea was that it had to be trade union movements, but it had to be a confederated network of people who have a democratically agreed programme. I think there's one lying about there somewhere, right? Who have a democratically agreed programme, right? And who are mobilising. And this is another thing about republicanism. It's about civic virtue. There's no greater civic virtue than these people who were prepared to go out and give their lives for a better future. That type of voluntarism is essential to republicanism, but it has to be underpinned, I think, by a critical understanding of the circumstances and by democratic support. So in that sense, this idea about building mass democratic movements, I actually said at the bar earlier on, is you have to have your understanding, your ideological understanding and your principles, but you have to open up your movement to people who don't completely share them, and you have to have a democratic exchange, and you have to try and agree what's our programme of agreement, what's our bottom line in terms of the type of Ireland we want to create. And then whenever you have a critical mass of support in society for that, it's much more difficult to defeat. And I think the reading history and reading a lot about Republican history and socialist history is that I don't doubt the bona fides of most people who engage in that, right? I think they were, but the lessons that we're drawing from it is that at several crucial junctures in our history, we had the opportunity to continue the struggle in a democratic form. The treaty's the one that just shouts at me all the time. And the structural relations were there and the forces were there to force Britain to give us far more than we got. But there were elements who were too keen just to sort themselves out. Griffith, Collins.
Surely this is the problem of that broad front, and you've seen in Catalonia most recently, of that broad front issue with people who aren't ideologically committed to the same goals and ideals. And then when you get to a certain stage, the shouting class, they've gone beaten, and I'm going to step in and betray you as usual, as they did in Catalonia as well. So I'm wondering about the democratic movement. And you thought, was that reformed in a sort of a political party or challenge?
No, it can take. It has to be. So I think the big debate in Britain at the minute is the Corbyn and Sultana falling out with each other. Yeah. And one of them is why I think Corbyn's very useful, and I think that they'll suffer electorally if he's not there. I actually agree with what Sultana's saying, is that you have an open. I have a great quote from a hero of mine, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And I don't want to butcher it, so it says, "The first step towards vice is to shroud innocent actions in mystery, and anyone who likes to conceal something sooner or later has a reason to conceal it." Right? So that's the rule for us. We don't conceal anything from ourselves, and we're open and democratic, and we have open and frank discussion. And then when we agree something, we have to stick to it. Now, you don't tell your enemy. You don't tell them everything that's on your head, and you have to operate, but you must operate, I think, within those democratic, open socialist principles. I think that's key. That, the lessons of our history is that on several occasions there have been mass movements dedicated to a proper democracy in Ireland, to the ownership of Ireland by the people of Ireland, run in a democratic fashion. I think there is a groundswell. I think the majority of people in this Ireland and an awful lot of our Protestant or brothers and sisters would like that type of Ireland as well. A domestic, egalitarian Ireland and democratic Ireland, and an ethical and moral foreign policy for Ireland. I think that the problem with that is the power structures that operate to try and to end that. And it's thinking about, and again, nobody has all the answers. I clearly don't have all the answers, but I think that's the lesson that I would draw from that sort of vicious circle of Republican mobilisation. Mass Republican mobilisation leading to defeat. Why? Because of the structural power relations.
Possibly. Would you also think maybe the objective wasn't clearly enough defined? If you define your objective as a united Ireland, then you're willing to accept removing partition under the auspices of the British Empire, United States Empire and the European Union's empire. Mm-hmm. And I suspect we had a mass movement in the provisionals in the 70s and 80s, but it was not, our objectives wasn't so clearly defined that by the time it come to a ceasefire, that it was possible for certain individuals to argue for what we ended up with.
And the thing about an open movement and a movement like this that engages ordinary people and it leads to a process of education, and people know what their movement stands for, know what their objectives are, and know what is acceptable and isn't acceptable. So if it does come to the point where somebody's going, well, actually, this is what it means, we go, well, check, come here. Put it to a vote and find out. Instead of ordinary people giving their political agency away, ordinary people should be involved in any process. And it's not, it's called struggle for a reason. It's not easy. Yeah, but I think that's...
So basically what you're talking about in a simplistic form is you're talking about people power in a participatory type democracy where all the little groups within areas have a say as to what happens ultimately.
Yeah.
They feed into that system.
We live in both Britain and Ireland, but Ireland in particular is one of the most centralised countries in the world in terms of government power. Right? I actually trust ordinary people. I spent my life as an educationalist. I've taught thousands of children, and I can tell you 99% of them were sound and wanted a good life and wanted to be good people and wanted to make a positive contribution. And I never thought any of the children that I taught didn't have great ability and a positive contribution to make in life. What they needed was confidence and trust. Now that sounds incredibly naive. That's why you need a movement. That's why you need a structure. And you shouldn't be naive about this. It's not idealism. We don't live in an ideal world. We're far from an ideal world. We live in a world where power structures and the nature of the system, the social system in we live, is predisposed towards limitless accumulation and concentration of wealth and power. Right? But I don't think that's very complicated. I don't think you needed a PhD to understand that.
No.
You just need to go to the shops and try and buy your shopping, your groceries. And if ordinary people understand that, then they're empowered to try and change it.
If you don't underline the alternative.
Yeah.
As Connolly said, unless we set about building a socialist republic, we're going to end up. You can remove the British Army, put up a green flag, but if you don't set about establishing a republic, you're going to Britain still contribute through her capitalists, through her businessmen, through her financial assets.
Yeah.
And the key part of that is, as you alluded to earlier, Fearghal, is that the building of these social entities within the country is a defence against the inevitable attacks that will come to destroy you.
Oh yeah,
You say the elite leadership then are either completely annihilated or co-opted or bought, and that happens. That is consistent throughout human history.
Yeah, it's the grave or the brown envelope seems to be the road. So and all I'm doing is just reflecting on having studied Republican history in particular quite deeply, but look at the trigger responses and look at the structures of power just in that presidential election campaign. Probably the most unoffensive socialist you'll ever meet in your life, but a genuine socialist in Catherine Connolly. And Ivan Yates come on and he says, what did he say? Well,
scammers being chased out.
Yeah.
Sure.
Look at Corbyn.
Yeah.
They had Corbyn painted as a racist, an anti-Semite, right? Because they control the media, they control the narrative, and they have the power and the wealth. But Corbyn also says, right, we are many and they are few.
That's it.
That's where the strength of people who have a conscience and people who believe in humanity, that's where our strength lies. That's why people come to schools in Fermanagh on a Saturday. That's why we're here, because we want a better society. That's what Jim Lynagh wanted, I would say. Okay? That's what all them lads who they didn't do it for fame or fortune. They didn't do it for ministerial cures, right? They did it because they wanted to try and change society for the better. What I would say though is, and I think this, if looking at Republican history, is that we shouldn't fall into the trap of the rules that the British have set for the game. Yes. And the rules that the British are set for the game is Republicans are physical force nutcases and constitutional nationalists are nice moral force pacifists. Anybody who listens to Micheál Martin and anybody who realises where the Southern establishment are taking the Irish people will know that that's a load of crap. It's the same crap that John Redmond peddled in 1914, that this is a false dichotomy. Tom Clark shot policemen in Dungannon, tried to plant bombs in England, but he spent 20 years working in a newspaper and trying to create a Sinn Féin movement, and he tried to create a mass movement in the Irish Volunteers. It was only under the conditions of the First World War, he says, we have to go ahead without the mass movement. We need a strike against imperialism. And James Connolly, who tried to build a mass-based socialist movement based on syndicalism, he came to the same conclusion. Under the conditions of imperialist war, with the floor of Europe are getting put through the grinder, then using political violence is legitimate. It's like Trotsky says, anyone who equates the political violence of the slaveholder with the slave uprising doesn't share our ethics. There's a qualitative difference between people using violence to struggle against oppression and the far bigger use of violence to impose oppression. Mm-hmm. CRL James says the same thing about the Haitian rebellion. He says, yes, the people engaged in that slave revolt that created the first ever free black republic, they killed people, yeah. But they didn't kill as many people as the slaveholders. And there's a qualitative difference. Like.
The problem when we see it now, even at the end of an arms struggle, 25 years at the end of an arms struggle, some people find it very, very difficult to change tack. It's something I find hard to understand because it's just a tactic of what we're at today. This is revolutionary today. This is part of the struggle today. And this is an enhancement of the struggle, and it's just another extension of what we had to do in the 70s, 60s, 70s and 80s. It's very difficult, but if you get caught up in not being able to change your tactic from an armed struggle into a democratic struggle or a people's struggle or the building of the democratic republic, you're not going anywhere. You're not going to achieve anything. They'll actually hold stuff back. And that's where we find ourselves. We find all the splits and the schisms and the small groups all dotted all over the place. We're wedded to some sort of an honouring of the armed struggle itself. It's political violence that's used as a tactic. And when hence that ceases to start to achieve your aim, you change your tactic.
What we'll do now is we'll break up into small groups and we'll have a question that we can talk about. So there's about 18 or 19 here, so we'll break into 4 groups of 4.
Before you move on, well, if you were touching on the sectarian,
mm-hmm.
that to me is very important. From my own experience of living a good while,
yeah.
It's there's a big, quite a lot of Protestants, whether they're Protestants or Presbyterians or Methodists, whatever they are, and they are as poor, and in some cases they're probably gone over the level of a lot of nationalist Catholics or whatever. I don't particularly like the word Catholic and Protestant, as it doesn't fit handy with me, but I found that it's not that hard to break through that. It might sound a bit daft, but I set up business in Ballyconnell in 1969, the same time as we were doing a lot of other things. But my first apprentice, he was Church of Ireland,
mm-hmm.
and my second apprentice was Presbyterian. And like I've had a whole lot, and I trained guys that went lots of places. I had one lad at least that was in the top 8 in Ireland, which was pretty good. That's in toolmaking, precision engineering, that type of thing. But we said those first 2 guys, and I had several other guys from Protestant. They never let me down, ever. And it's amazing, even today, like I would have people coming from that side, if they have a problem, even though I don't have too much power, they still bring their problems to me and they say, we know where you are, but we give you credit for standing where I mean, I don't make any difference between anybody.
Jump in now.
I greet most people in our own language, and if they want to, and I had a big birthday a couple of years ago, and some of my Protestant neighbours, the cards that I got were in totally nice, you know, fucking barely on at all. So it's if you can get through, we could be. I would have more confidence if I were standing in an election with some of them voting for me than those who pretended to have been Republicans who definitely weren't.
Yes, but I think I think the thing here is that you think back to the basis of imperial power. Divide, conquer and rule is the basic tactic and strategy of imperialism. Divide, conquer and rule, and you have to create a division because the working class, if left to its own devices, will unite. And the thing that has terrified unionism and its masters in London is the unity of Protestant and Catholic. And it has manifested itself several times through the last century. 1907, there was a general strike in Belfast where Catholic and Protestant united. The only time in history that the RIC mutinied. The RIC in Musgrave Park refused to protect the black legs that were brought in from London and Liverpool to break the strike. RIC now, this was the Peelers, refused to go out and do it. So terrified was London that they sent in the cavalry up the Falls Road to shoot and kill people, and then the story went out that the Fenians have rose again, so sectarianism was brought in. They, again, 1919, general strike, and in the 1930s there was the
outdoor relief.
Outdoor relief. And every time the potential of unity was smashed through sectarianism, through the use of the Orange Card, because in 1795 the British government effectively set up two organisations. One, the Orange Order, based in Loughgall, and the other was Maynooth.
Yeah.
Like this was what, 35?
Sectarianism and racism is a tool of imperialism.
It is. They use anything at all to divide the working class.
The best treatment of this is Theodore Allen's The Creation of the White Race, which is actually about the United States of America, but the first half of the book's about Ireland. And he says that race is a social concept. It's not inherent in people, which is scientifically correct.
Sure.
He says that race and sectarianism is a social instrument. And I originally was going to talk about Labour politics in Tyrone and Fermanagh till we had I think the conversation was probably more stimulating than the lecture, to be honest. But I have a book coming out next year called Red Triangle, and it's about working class anti-sectarian trade unionism. And will you hear this? Dungannon, Lorgan, Portadown, between 1918 and the shipyard clearances in 1920. And it was led by a group of Protestant Conleyite socialists from Belfast, Sam Kyle, Dawson Gordon. They set up a thing called the Workers' Union. They had 100,000 members. They had strikes throughout the whole area, right? And then the shipyard expulsions were specifically designed not to counter republicanism in Belfast, it wasn't that strong. It was to get the Belfast Labour Party out of City Hall. Dennis Houston gave the first speech. He was the only Catholic, and he was later ITDWU. He gave his first speech in Belfast City Hall in Irish, Dennis Houston. Jimmy Bird, who was the Boilermakers in Queen's Island, turned up in his dungarees, and he got dungaree bird. And Sam Kyle and Dawson Gordon were socialist Republicans. Sam Kyle topped the poll in the Shankill ward. Right? Now, that's one point. The other point is you can't overcome sectarianism by acknowledging the structures in a sectarian fashion. You can't reach out to working class Protestant people if you actually publicly acknowledge that this is a sectarian problem, and if you're willing to basically play Britain's game. Say, we're too, yes, I'm an irrational Catholic. Are you an irrational Protestant? Let's have a patronage network and share the diminishing returns of what we're getting for the block grant. You can't make a Republican and anti-sectarian case if you jettison republicanism and buy into sectarianism. You can't do it. You can't build an anti-sectarian socialist republic if you abandon anti-sectarianism, you abandon socialism, and you might say you abandon republicanism as well. You know, it's...
I tell you one little joke on this we have the dinner.
Well, we're not there yet.
It's not necessarily what we made components for different factories all over the country and outside it, but mostly in steel. But we made a lot of parts for this particular company, and anyway, the man, I suppose, probably was often marching himself, but he rang me up one 12th and he says, "Are you bringing me any stuff up today? We would put all the components in skips and put them on my van and go up." So I says, "I'd probably be up after dinner with some." He says, "If you're coming, will you bring me some IRA posters?" This man was Presbyterian and his wife was Church of Ireland from Enniskillen. And so I says, "I will." I says, "It took you a long time to come round." He says, "Just bring them up." So I went up after dinner, I delivered, went round the back to the factory, he came out with the forklift, lifted off the skip. He says, did you bring them? I says, I did, there was always stuff around the place, it was paste box, join this, join whatever. So I gave them to him. He says, there's 2 machines in there sitting idle today, there's 2 men gone walking when they should be working, that gone to the Martins, and him trying to get a load of stuff out. And so when everybody was gone home and it was quiet, he got the posters and he put it on the 2 boys' machines, and he says to me, that'll put the walk on off them, it's me have to pay them on Friday. That's true, that's as true as I'm sitting on the chair. So, yeah.
We can break up into different areas for any